Welcome to the Xceptional Insights podcast. I'm Sean Wargo, and I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Hansen.
Hello.
Together, we make up the market intelligence team here at AVIXA,
where it's our job to identify trends in the economy and understand how they affect our industry, the professional audiovisual industry.
Hello, this is Sean Wargo and Peter Hansen from AVIXA, back with another episode of the Xceptional Insights podcast. This month, we're here to talk about the recession. Lots of news about it, whether or not we're slipping perhaps more into a recession likelihood scenario. Also, stock markets responded. Jobs reports have been coming in. Lots of data for us to talk about. And as always, we want to talk a little bit about if there is one, what would it look like for ProAV? What's the impact? And maybe even kind of frame it up in terms of a risk for our industry. So where we're going to start, of course, is Peter, give us a lay of land. How is the recession risk looking at this point? What's the over-under for us?
Well, first and foremost, we're not at a point where we're staring down the barrel of a recession. What we're seeing in the numbers, and this is especially clear in the employment numbers, is that the trajectory has been cooling for a long time from like a fever pitch. You know, we talk about like the big quit 2 years ago. For the Pro AV industry, it was a little bit in the background because supply issues were so severe, but it was really difficult to hire people. There was so much more demand for workers than there were worker availability. And that's slowly kind of shifted. The scales are balancing. And right now we've reached a level where the conditions are now cooler than they were pre-pandemic. They probably still favor workers a little bit in terms of like where the balance of power is, the amount of worker availability relative to worker demand. But it's a lot more neutral. And the trajectory is pointing downwards towards, if you draw the line out far enough, a recessionary environment where worker availability is high, unemployment is high, companies aren't hiring. And that's creating this question of where do we go from here? Are we on the cusp of a recession? And the odds, I would say, are higher now of kind of recession starting in the next 6 to 9 months than they were before. Now, people thought the odds were quite high. Late in 2022, they thought they were high. They were wrong. that recession didn't happen. We had actually great economic growth by GDP in the U.S., a little bit weaker in some other areas, weaker in Europe, but still mostly dodged recession. But now, particularly in the U.S., we're seeing that weakness in the labor market. We're seeing more countries in Europe kind of just on that border where their growth isn't as good as they want. Balance of probability still points towards growth for 2025, potentially even better growth than we're having maybe globally in 2024. But there's just a higher risk. You know, we're on this trajectory that's facing downwards, and the question is, when does it bottom out, or when does it turn back the way we want it to? And that's the driver of some questions. We saw a big stock market decline in kind of like end of July, early August, that then bounced back. But then earlier this week of this recording, another tough day in the market, and risk is higher now. There's more uncertainty, so it's something that I think businesses should be thinking about just to make sure they're dotting I's and crossing T's.
So one of the things that we had talked about through the last 3 or 4 years about this potential recessionary risk is that it's different than perhaps other recessions we've seen in the past, sectorally, potential duration, potential impact. Would you say that's also still true? So if we were to face a recession, let's say we maybe even already in one, depending on how Q3 comes out from a numbers perspective, could it be the fact that the Fed still has the lever to pull of inflation, interest rates? They could, of course, pull them down, and that would potentially spur some further growth. So, talk to me about the scale of the risk, I guess, is the question that would be on the table there.
Yeah, the kind of core of logic of what you're talking about there is that the anticipation of this recession is that it was going to be caused by the Federal Reserve putting the brakes on the economy, raising interest rates to reduce inflation. And then what follows from that is that they put these brakes on the economy and the economy slows down. All they have to do is take their foot off those brakes and the economy reaccelerates. It's a contrast to, let's say, the Great Recession, where they put interest rates to zero and they needed more juice, but they had nowhere to go, right? Because that was such a severe recession. Here we have increased interest rates, not at an astronomical level, but like a moderate one, 5.5 benchmark at the Fed. And that gives the Fed quite a long way to go. And especially after this couple years at relatively high interest rates, it creates a fair bit of potential, I think a little bit pent up demand for investment or pent up kind of desire to invest that businesses, it's not that they have not at all been investing. If you've got a good investment, you want to buy a house, you want to expand your business, you'll still do it at the current interest rate environment. But there's probably been a lot of borderline decisions or sort of scale decisions that are a little bit lower because of the interest rate environment. Or there's potentially a lot of people just waiting to refinance, maybe pull out a little money or free up their finances a little bit more for more spending as soon as they can get an interest rate that's 3%, even 5% lower. So there's a lot of potential for growth as soon as the Fed lowers interest rates. And that's a good reason why you should be a little less scared of a recession in the near term than maybe just that sort of generic random recession that hits for whatever reason.
So we would expect then that even if the Fed were to, of course, lower interest rates, which is looking increasingly likely based on the data situation that we're facing, it would take some time, right? It would take some time for those interest rates to percolate down into the market enough where they feel like, okay, it's a better time to invest, capital expenditure, all those sorts of things. But in theory, it should keep any recession timeline to a more minimal time frame. Maybe we hit the bare minimum of a recession technical definition of 2 quarters as an example, which would mean, let's say Q3 starts and we go into next year and we're already starting to feel recovery. Is that kind of what would be a reasonable expectation?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. Because, I'd even emphasize, they don't have to get the rates all the way down to rock bottom to start feeling those effects. There's a lot of kind of confidence effects already when the Fed shows they're committed to the expansionary monetary policy that's necessary to put the wind behind the sails of the economy. That forestalls a lot of the business fear, consumer fear, that creates that negative feedback cycle where people stop spending money and then revenue declines and then people are more scared and they stop spending more money. So because there's that strength of the Fed's contractionary position right now, it does give them a lot of power to ensure that this one's short.
Yeah. Let's start translating it over to Pro AV. So one of the theories would be we have an experienced economy, right, that's been bolstering us. We've got investments in collaboration that's been rock solid. One of the few areas for Pro AV that continue to grow through the pandemic, content production streaming, which we now refer to more as broadcast AV capability. All of those have been areas that have done well. And of course, now we're shifting even more into experienced economy. What kinds of headwinds would we face would be the question that our industry might ask. And so one of the things that I'll put out, and it's of course challenge as we go, is we've also seen some deflation in our market. While we brought out new technologies over the last few years, we've seen AI come into the mix a little bit from a feature set perspective. We have new tech basically that's solving problems, and some of that has actually come at a lower cost to the customer, the end user. And so you could say that deflation further helps us, right? You can buy more, do more with less money. There's challenge implicit in that of commoditization, margin erosion, that sort of thing. But I think one of the things I would theorize is that even in recession, there's enough strength built into Pro AV. We weathered the pandemic recession effectively through adaptation. Are there other adaptations that you would point to, and or One of them being, of course, experience economy. Is there any threat that you might see on that front? If with the consumer being a big part of the overall driver of economy, if they pulled back, does that risk some of the tailwind that was the experience economy at all in your mind?
It's a really good question. And a few years back, we looked kind of a vertical market, kind of buying cause, kind of like and our end users, how they spend money, how those sectors fare in recession. And that kind of experience economy area that you point out is the one that is pretty challenged. When consumers have less money to spend, it's luxuries that they spend less on. And that tends to be not retail necessarily overall, but high-end retail, kind of maybe the more retailtainment type area that is the driver of Pro AV spending in retail. And, let's say concerts. They maybe don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on a super high-end concert. They'll maybe do more local. Actually, something that was interesting and maybe a little surprised to me is cinema actually can do pretty well in a recession because it's more expensive these days than it used to be, but it's still a lot more of a kind of budget night out opportunity than a live show. So in general, it's a good place to call out as a bit of downside risk potentially. The one counterpoint, I think that AV businesses need to not just see it the way they always saw it, is that we're still getting back to where we were. There's still recently trying to do a little exercise that maybe we'll talk about in the podcast in the next episode, a couple episodes from now, but comparing the vision by revenue in IOTA of 2024 and the 2019 IOTA, like the last pre-pandemic IOTA, to the current vision of 2024 overall. Interestingly, the kind of overall number is the same, but under there's a lot of changes in pricing and a lot of kind of sectoral shifts. And one of the main sectoral shifts you see is that the experience economy is not where we had projected it out to be in 2024. It's a lot lower. And that's because we postponed or had a huge decline, that had a nice recovery, but only got us back to ground zero in like 2022, 2023, even 2024 for like the certain segments. So we're way below there. And I think that means that if a recession hits, I don't anticipate quite the same sudden downturn there. Like people just cherish it that little bit more still. They're still getting their hearts back in equilibrium after being held back so far in the pandemic. So I don't think the classical traditional logic of they all go away from that applies to the same extent for the upcoming recession, one in the next year, as it would if it happened in 2028 or if it happened in 2018.
Yeah, and it seems to me the other thing bolstering us beyond experience economy, of course, the normal recessionary bellwethers look like they would hold strong. You and I have talked in other podcasts and even offline about healthcare, certainly as one of those sectors where, sure, it's specialization of technology, but there are plenty of outward-facing components of it, lobbies, patient reception areas, those sorts of things where Pro AV, as a more traditional sense, would have an opportunity. So clearly, growth would continue in healthcare, probably at even better levels than what we're currently forecasting. The other would be government and military. Geopolitically, internationally, there's certainly a lot of focus on that. There's good cause for investments in things like new energy sources, any of those kinds of emphasis, infrastructure types of investments. So you would expect those to continue as well. I think probably the questions in a lot of people's mind is, what about corporate? What about education? The true bellwethers. They know there's growth in venues and entertainment and kind of the experience economy aspects, but would look to see, is there any kind of impact to corporate and education? I would almost isolate them out. And to me, that story is it goes beyond a recessionary consideration at this point. As we've talked about what's going on in, say, corporate, we were benefiting from a change to a hybrid model, work from home, remote work, all that kind of thing. During the pandemic, that sort of stabilized. We've already been forecasting and are building in a decline in growth in that area for corporate. Education was similar. They made a lot of investments. They're sort of stabilizing, reassessing, and likely reinvesting over the coming years. And as we noted before, there's new technologies that make some of that investment even more efficient, effective going forward. Is there anything that we would look at that might say that those would do better during a recession? We could talk perhaps about if there is, say, an even more emphasis on an employer's market, more layoff, more contraction of workforce. Corporate could be in a situation where employees are expected to come back. So that may mean more investment in collaboration technology embedded in office spaces. Education, I'm not quite as sure, but yeah, let's go with that a little bit and see what might happen to those two kind of bellwether markets.
Yeah, well, I'll back up and I'll take all four markets.
Yeah,
Healthcare, just to emphasize, if you look at kind of the line of healthcare revenue and throw on recession periods in your graph with that, there's no relation. Healthcare ignores recession completely. Then you take government and military. Depends a little bit. State and local governments actually do tend to have a bit of a crunch in a recession. And then more like federal governments, national governments, who have a lot more ability to finance deficit spend, that's a bit more robust. But it's not quite as perfect as healthcare in terms of like just ignores the recession completely. Some sections get a little boost. Some are a little bit more challenged. But it's good overall. It's a good place to be. Then education is sort of like next best, where it's a lot of federal funding, and that can be or government funding, and that's positive for it. There's also oftentimes a bit of increase in demand. People get laid off, they can't get rehired, they use education to kind of fill that gap in the resume, upskill, and then get a new job. So it's got a little bit of, but it's challenged in a recession environment. State budgets get tighter, they give less to universities, factors like that matter. So I see education not too affected overall. I think a relatively normal, like you say, like bit of a spending boost, build out early pandemic, getting AV throughout. Then we've been in a bit of a deficit. Things are built out ahead of schedule. It's more maintenance. We're not related to the refresh cycle necessarily. Or also we're just gone too far on AV necessarily for kind of the vision was maybe this remote university, and it's like, we're going to be in person. We don't need that much, image magnification or audio or that caliber of audio, because everyone's going to be in the room. Just a little speaker is probably enough. So I don't see too much delta from recession for there, but I think corporate's the really interesting one, because there's two effects, and I'll hear people talk about one, or I'll talk about the other, and I don't know which of the two effects is going to predominate. There's a cost effect where companies are spending a fair bit of money on their office space, and recession hits, and the profit falters, and the directive come downs. We need to cut costs. We're outspending our revenue, and all of a sudden that status quo of having a bunch of space, but it's only used in a hybrid fashion. Maybe you've got a 3-day-a-week policy, but people are only doing 2. There's some scofflaws who are getting away with not doing any. All of a sudden, because do we really need that? Can we cut this cost and be sufficiently viable? Something we talked about in 2022 was emphasizing we kind of reached a hybrid equilibrium. A lot of people are saying like, oh no, the corporate office market, like the bottom's going to fall out. And we at AVIXA are saying no, because the question is, when does the shoe drop? Like, why would it happen in 2022 that all of a sudden this like level of like demand, which is like much weaker than pre-pandemic, but is not so weak that the bottom has fallen out, why would it all of a sudden drop now? Why would it all of a sudden drop in 6 months? Why would it all of a sudden drop in 2023? We didn't believe it. We encouraged people not to think that way, and that's proven fully correct so far. But the logic of why would this shoe drop changes when there's a recession. The recession is a reason why the shoe might drop. that doesn't mean it's going to be the shoe drop, because there's also a counterpoint, which is that when a recession happens, businesses want to have less staff. They also have a bit more power to kind of pick and choose in their staff too. Like, the employees have had the power in recent years with labor markets being really tight, employers being desperate to hire. In a recession, that changes. And now the employers have plenty of people to hire from. Their employees are lucky to have the jobs they do. And so the power dynamics change, and that might mean that employers are able to bring more people back to the office. Or they choose to bring people back to the office because they want to push a few people, 3%, 5% of the labor force out the door without doing layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a clear counterpoint why actually recession could be good for the corporate office market. Could be bad by cost, could be good by bringing people back in. I'm a little bit more worried about the cost side. I do think that, I think now in 2024, entering 2025, we're kind of getting this place where like the equilibrium, the hybrid level is, people are comfortable there. I don't think companies are thinking too much about like redoing that, or I don't feel like they're too held out from their goals by their current equilibrium, current labor market power, but it could change. So I'm a little bit more worried about the cost side, but there's both strong, impactful reasons to think both ways. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think there's a timing challenge too with the cost side. So some of that relies on leases coming up for renewal, right? So if your timing is such that as a company, it happens to perfectly align where, gosh, profit margin is challenged, revenues are challenged. The lever we can pull because of timing is we can finally let the shoe drop and really decrease our space costs. But what you and I have both watched in this market so far is a flight to quality. So what seems to happen instead is, yes, they may take less square footage for their office space, but then they're like, yeah, but we'd really like to shift our location to a more desirable one so that we can impact the pressure side, like create the compelling reason for people to come back to the office. So net, we end up at worst kind of a flat in the spending, right? And maybe a shift around a little bit, but for the most part, we seem to be holding so far. That's been the story that you and I have talked about and kind of pointed to in the data from many of the federal sources, which are showing office leasing is held and grown pretty well from a spending standpoint. So it would seem that it's been difficult for any company to really pull that lever of decreased costs so far. That just hasn't really sort of happened that much. Instead, what seems to be playing out a little bit more is there's been, especially in Pro AV, an emphasis on volume instead of value. We're not going to spend as much on a given room. We're going to try to spread the investment a little bit, get some efficiencies, get scalability. I think that continues. So net of all the factors that we're talking about, actually, as we sit here and talk about it and look at what we forecasted for 24 and 25 growth for things like corporate, for industry overall, I think we've done a reasonable job of estimating in these kinds of effects to where we see growth in 2024 as a little bit less than it was in 2023. There was still some strong incoming recovery money being invested, some growth there. There were challenges in the market for sure in 23. We talked a lot about bullwhip effects and supply chain recovery and all that sort of stuff. But net of that, we expect 2024, having come through that and facing some of these economic headwinds, possibility of recession, inflation, interest rates, all those sorts of things. Our 2024 growth rate is at a little bit as almost a point less than 2023. As we look at 25, as we're kind of talking about, let's say we hit a recession now between now and the end of the year. But as we go into 25, we may be meaningfully looking better. We start to hit recovery already from what was a brief, hopefully shallow employment on a recessionary risk, and we start recovering in 2025. So our 2025 growth expectations for Pro AV right now are actually better than 2024. So you and I have characterized that as a little bit of a saddle effect. I think what we're ultimately debating, and many will be, is the scale of the saddle. Could we end up pulling more points out of 2024 growth, maybe pushing it forward instead of pulling it pulling it into the current year. We're pushing it out instead of pulling it forward, I guess would be the proper analogy. That's what we'd seen so far in recovery, but we could end up pushing it out a little bit. As we consider all the pros and cons, though, ups and downs, it would seem that it's hard to imagine much of an adjustment, if any. I think the net effects across the various sectors help us. And that's really the story, I think. We've talked over the years about the benefit of an industry, or one of the strengths of an industry like ours, is that we are not so sector dependent. And we do have some reliance on some core areas, but we tend to be able to shift, to diversify, pandemic as proof of that, into sectors that will sort of remain a bit more stable. So that to me increases confidence a little bit in the estimate that we've put out there, barring black swans, which are probably not even worth too much of debate because they could come from any direction at any time, and are therefore hard to know where that might go. So I guess where I would land with this conversation to me is, yes, less growth in 2024, some better growth on the outer years, 25, 26 perhaps, but on net, I think we're not seeing any intrinsic specific weaknesses. There's enough over and unders that kind of average out to sort of almost a status quo and expectation. Mm-hmm. How would you see it different, if at all?
Yeah, I think for me, maybe the risk we haven't talked about, I think we see maybe a little bit more steady. It's a little bit hard to precisely identify where it would suffer the most in a recession, just because there's still that return to in-person tailwind. Mm-hmm. The area where I feel like maybe potentially the most challenge for business is we hit a recession, demand softens, we actually just got a supply is like almost all better, and all of a sudden there's quite a bit of price pressure, bit of a race to the bottom, some deflation, and that harming revenue, harming bottom lines for maybe manufacturers, distributors, even integrators, kind of trying to get their value of resale, and consumers. There's a lot of just competition on price. I think that could be the one challenge that might make revenue numbers difficult. One little way I agree with your interpretation. The saddle, I believe in it. What I could see is like right now we kind of have the saddle timed of like 2024 is the lower point, and then 2025 is the higher point. It wouldn't surprise me if that kind of saddle effects gets pushed out, and then like maybe like it's late 2024 into early 2025, and therefore we're not pushing from 2024 to 2025. We're pushing from 2024 and 2025 into late 2025, early 2026. Mm-hmm. Could be, where the exact timing of that 3 months later, 6 months later than the initial IOTA. I think the last question to me is, what should Pro AV businesses be doing? And I think the two parts that stand out for me is, one, thinking very carefully about supply, thinking how much do we have, what is our buying, what is our market research for these trends, because you've been in a crazy period, and have you rethunk like what is the right strategy for this new era? What is this right strategy when recession risk is out there? Are you optimized for that? And then two, we've got these uncertainties like corporate. There's a couple arguments could go either way. Entertainment type, there's maybe a reason to think, it'll fare better than it would normally in a recession. But like in a normal recession, there's challenges there. So how can you manage it? Just make sure, to the extent you're diversified, you're reinforcing that diversification. Your business development, you're keeping the business development staff from being too concentrated in one area. If you're considering a couple candidates and one has a broader portfolio of connections, like that might be the right one. What would you say, kind of just thinking, maybe final point, like businesses making their last preparations or trying to be ready for that new era with a little downside risk, what should they be taking away to be optimized?
It's probably a lesson that's been painfully learned over the last several years, but over-response is a danger, right? In these sorts of situations, as we get into an uncertain environment, recession risks that have been seemingly pervasive, all that kind of stuff, the risk to businesses is over response. We saw that certainly you could argue in the supply chain constraint. There were companies that were really sitting on a lot of inventory. They bought up expecting that they might hit continual shortage, and that left them with some carrying costs and some challenges essentially from a margin perspective. You could say that, overhiring is another where, we want to grab market, we want to grab resource. I think caution is the better part of valor here. It's basically, yes, looking at how you're diversified, looking at your client portfolio, looking at your capabilities portfolio. Have we done enough in digital signage? Have we done enough in broadcast AV? How are we diversifying beyond just a traditional corporate type of customer? Are we involved in RFPs for venues, transportation, hospitality, retail sectors? So it's continual work. The challenge too is this could be brief enough that you're just starting to build responses and then the core customer starts to return. So all of that though is the same message. It's pay attention, but the same business strategies are applying that have applied over the last several years of being cautious, but being evaluative, looking at data sources that help you see where there's some new opportunity, and kind of staying the course, not over responding with it.
Subtle optimizations rather than
exactly major moves.
Total replanning.
Yeah, easy to say, right? I mean, when the chips are down and you're looking at revenues in decline, which by the way, none of our data sources on the integration side have pointed to yet. So even if there is, say, slowdown looming for Pro AV, I would say nothing on our data horizon other than sort of down chain a little bit, manufacturer, unevenness, distributor, that kind of thing. But integrators as a market segment continuing to do pretty well and growing. So nothing yet suggesting weakness. But if it does happen, then of course the temptation is let's lay off. Let's reduction in forces or reduction in space. All those kinds of measures become more compelling. But I would say this, unlike, say, pandemic, this is one where you may perhaps batten down a little bit, but the horizon looks good. There is silver lining to clouds. There's sunshine emerging in the not too distant future. As
end of the
things
tunnel
really
is
improve.
closer.
Absolutely. As the market conditions improve, so should Pro AV as we go along with it. So, as you can hear from us, I think general optimism as we look at recessionary risk. We still keep it in the same sort of category as there, but perhaps not as pervasive or long range as we've seen in the past. Stay tuned as we explore this and other topics in future podcasts. Thanks for joining us. It's been Peter and Sean on the Xceptional Insights podcast. We'll be back. Looking forward to it.